So it's good to be here. I've been retired not all that long, just as of May, so I'm sort of just getting used to the not having to go to work on Monday. So that's nice. So this morning I want to talk about waterfalls and wildflowers, something that most people don't combine, but I thought, why not combine the two? Because both are awfully nice and both are very abundant in our neck of the woods. So let's begin by talking about waterfalls, falling water. And of course, our most common experience with falling water is rainfall. But if you're on the coast, of course, falling water is waves crashing along the shore. But here in the mountains, of course, it's water falling, cascading, tumbling over rocks that gets our attention. You know, I wonder if could we maybe turn off these lights? I think the slides might show up a little better. Now, don't fall asleep on me. Well, people, is that okay? Is that better? Okay. Well, people have been interested in waterfalls for a very long time, not just because of their beauty, but because of the myths, legends associated with them. The Cherokee, for example, and many other original and ancient peoples believe that gods, spirits, and the like reside amongst waterfalls. And of course, waterfalls have captured the imagination of painters and poets for a very long time. And musicians produce music, in some cases trying to emulate the natural sounds of waterfalls to perhaps soothe the soul. And waterfalls sometimes appear in films, usually to convey action, adventure, sometimes romance, danger. And advertisers like to associate their products with the pristine nature of waterfalls. And you see waterfall images in lots of different places, including license plates, postage stamps, here falls, dinner plates. In Great Smoky Mountain National Park, here is Ramsey Cascade. Some of you may have hiked the trail there. And on the soft drink machines in the visitor center at Great Smoky Mountain National Park, there's an image of Ramsey Cascades. Well, you never know where you're going to see an image of a waterfall. Just up the road in the men's bathroom at Chimney Rock State Park, here's Hickory Nut Falls. Anybody know if this image is on the wall in the women's bathroom there? I asked somebody that and they said, no, it's not. I think you women need to, request. Well, what draws us to waterfalls? Why are they so magical? What is it about a waterfall that causes people that aren't hikers to sometimes hike miles and miles to get to a waterfall? What draws you to a waterfall? What do you like most about a waterfall? What do you like? The view.
And the sound.
The sound, okay. The sound?
If you're hot,
The cooling. Now don't give my talk away here. Now you can. Anybody else? What do you like? What's special about a waterfall? Yeah.
serenity.
The serenity, okay. Yeah.
The power of the water.
The power of water. Okay.
Chance for a good picture.
Chance for a good picture. You all are giving my talk away, but that's great. The waterfalls is the first half of the talk, and the wildflowers is the second. But let me continue with things that you've said, and there'll be a little bit of repetition. But of course, the moving water, I think, is part of the attraction. The constantly moving water of the falls. How the water's brightly lit. Look how the water, it's bright white. It's bright white. Water flowing in the river is typically not bright white. And of course, water is a reflective surface, and why we have that color. And often the contrast of that bright white water against dark rocks and green foliage. So the beauty of the waterfall. And of course, no two waterfalls are alike. No two waterfalls are alike, which I think adds to the lure of something's going to be different when you go to a waterfall. Some waterfalls kind of slide gently down the rocks, and we're impressed with that sort of gentle, serenity that is portrayed. In other cases, we're impressed with the height of the falls, such as Whitewater Falls, not far from here. And then the raw power, as you mentioned, such as Rainbow Falls at Gorges State Park. But a waterfall doesn't have to be big or tall to convey beauty. This tiny, tiny little unnamed waterfall is beautiful and serene, peaceful. So waterfalls are exhilarating. I think that's part of it. You get a sense of exhilaration when you're standing by the falls, and I'm not sure what's causing that. Some people say negative ions or something. I don't really know what that's all about. But certainly being by the waterfall puts a smile on your face. I think often you're happier coming back from the falls than maybe you were hiking into the falls. And of course, many of us like to snap a photo at the falls, as you suggested. And I snapped this photo on the right, on your right, of my dog Woody, my often hiking companion to waterfalls. And this is Jones Gap Falls, not far from here, Jones Gap State Park in South Carolina. Something else about waterfalls is that they're constantly changing. Even while you're at the waterfall and maybe you're there for half an hour or so, you notice change. Clouds sweeping across the sky obscure the sun. And so the change in light, changes the appearance of the waterfall. So the sound can change, the mood of the waterfall can change, the light can change, the number of people at the falls can change. So waterfalls are constantly changing moment by moment, day by day. So part of the attraction of going to waterfalls is that even if you go to the same waterfall time and time again, you see something different each time. Adds to the fun. Just as an example of that change is after a heavy rainfall event, a modest river, a modest waterfall may change to a roaring torrent of water, as you see on your left. Conversely, during dry periods, the waterfall may change to just a trickle, much to the disappointment of hikers to the falls. And then a rainbow. A rainbow, if the light is just right and there's a mist in the air, a rainbow may form, such as here at Rainbow Falls, appropriately named, off of Gorges State Park. And of course, there are many waterfalls that are named Rainbow Falls. There's a very beautiful one in Great Smoky Mountain National Park, for example. But these rainbows are ephemeral. They're short-lived. As clouds obscure the sun, the rainbow disappears. If the wind dies down and the mist isn't being carried up the slope here at Rainbow Falls, that rainbow disappears. And of course, waterfalls change seasonally. Here's Crabtree Falls off the Blue Ridge Parkway, on the left in winter and on the right in early spring. And of course, as you mentioned, the sound of the waterfall is part of the experience. And if you're hiking to the falls, you often hear the waterfall before you see it, adding to the anticipation of getting to the waterfall. But it's not just our eyes and our ears that we perceive a waterfall. If you hike to the falls on a hot summer day, a cold downdraft near the falls and the mist together cool your skin on that hot summer day. I was at a waterfall and a young girl called out to her parents, "There's free air conditioning here." And botanically, from a botanical aspect and actually a zoological aspect as well, that cool, moist air creates a microclimate that's different than the surroundings. And plants and animals respond, and that you often find plants and animals that are typically found at much higher elevations occurring at lower elevations because of that different microclimate. It's kind of interesting. How did they find their way to this spot? Here's Crabtree Falls at an elevation of 3,200 feet. And mountain wood sorrel, this plant here, is growing. This is a plant that you typically find in spruce fir forests at elevations above about 6,000 feet. So let's talk a little bit about some of the plants that occur near waterfalls. And this is the so-called spray cliff community. The botanical name for the plants around waterfalls, around that spray, is appropriately called the spray cliff community. A nice name for this community. And sometimes the spray cliff community is rather sparse. Here's Silver Run Falls near Cashers, just below Cashers. And the vegetation on the rocks near the falls is quite sparse. Where here at Station Cove Falls in South Carolina, near the town of Walhalla, if you haven't been to Station Cove Falls, how many of you have been there to Station Cove Falls? Some of you have. Oh, so if you, Station Cove Falls is one of the premier wildflower spots in the region, certainly in all of South Carolina. And it's a Piedmont site. It's in the upper Piedmont. It's just kind of close to the beginning of the Blue Ridge Mountains, near the town of Walhalla off Highway 11. It's one of the waterfalls that's described in my book. It's a fabulous short hike. It's only a mile in to the falls, and it's very rich in wildflowers, and the falls is quite nice too. It's near the town of Walhalla off Highway 11. Okay. So that's one to put on your bucket list as a place to go, both for the wildflowers and waterfalls. But I point out Station Cove Falls here. Not only is that area rich in wildflowers as you hike to the falls, but the spray cliff community itself is very lush. So why this difference? Sparse vegetation here in the spray cliff, very lush here. Well, lots of things can drive that. One would be the type of rock and its tendency to form cracks and fissures and terraces. A little bit more on that later. Also the availability of soil. Sometimes there's very little soil present. The exposure, south versus north-facing slope, can play a role. The volume and constancy of water is a factor. Water is one of those things that too much can be a problem. If you're in a large watershed or steep slopes nearby and you get, after a rainstorm, an enormous amount of water, that water can just very quickly wash away any soil and plants that are present. So disturbance is a factor influencing the amount of vegetation present at any one point in time. Okay, so just mosses are particularly common in the spray cliff community. People that study mosses just love the spray cliff community. And a little bit on mosses as to why they're so common. First of all, the leaf-like structures that make up a moss are very unusual in that they're only single cell thick. You know, a normal leaf, think of a magnolia leaf, they're multiple cells thick. In the case of moss, it's just a single cell layer thick, and there's no waxy cuticle. So mosses can take up moisture directly from the air. And in fact, that's how they get their moisture, from the air. They don't take it up via roots. So in a spray cliff, you've got all this moist air around you, and so it's a very good microclimate for mosses. Also, mosses, unlike flowering plants, can colonize bare rock. Okay, they don't need soil, right? Because they don't need it soil as a source of moisture. So mosses tend to be particularly abundant, lots of species. In the Whitewater Falls there, I don't have a slide for this today, but in Whitewater Falls there was a botanical survey. Dr. Dan Patillo and a student of his surveyed the mosses in the Whitewater, along a section of the Whitewater River, and they found something like 300 different species of mosses, which represents something like 25% of the moss species known to North America, north of Mexico. So in one, part of that reflects the fact that mosses reproduce by spores, and those spores get around. So a lot of those spores of moss species have found their way to Whitewater Falls. Okay, ferns also occur in the Spray Cliff community. Here's mountain spleenwort in the genus Asplenium. Botany by flashlight. Well, in the Spray Cliff community you have ledges and crevices, narrow crevices. In some cases you have these cave-like structures where in these dimly lit habitats you've got mosses and in some cases a few ferns. And this is Dan Patillo with a flashlight looking at a fern called Appalachian shoestring fern, which is a tropical fern that actually grows. One of the things about the Spray Cliff community is that the microclimate doesn't fluctuate as much. It's a more stable climate because of the presence of water, so it tends not to get too hot or too cold. So there are a number of species that are associated, or their closest relatives occur in the tropics, that are occurring in our Blue Ridge Mountains in this community. Flowering plants. Well, as you know, flowering plants need to grow in soil. There are a few exceptions, but 99.9% of flowering plants need soil to grow because it's from soil that they get their moisture. So unlike mosses, flowering plants are not able to grow on bare rock, but they do occur, like at Hickory Nut Falls, just up the road. If you go there, you'll notice this scene here where you've got, and other waterfalls as well, you'll notice that flowering plants are hanging precariously on the cliff, and what they're doing is they're growing in only certain microhabitats where there are cracks and fissures in the rock, where small amounts of soil have collected, and they're able to get their roots into that soil and grow. Eventually, they're likely to be washed away in a heavy storm, or as the plant gets larger, that soil may not be able to accommodate the moisture needs of the plant, and it may become desiccated, or sometimes gravity comes into play and the plant just comes crashing down to the ground. So, but you do see flowering plants like this, but also on narrow ledges or terraces, larger volumes of soil can collect, and there you have a higher density and often a higher richness of species. I don't recommend exploring plants in the Spray Cliff community because of the danger of walking on those slippery rocks, also because of the disturbance that you'd cause. But you can have a pair of binoculars. I often bring up my butterfly binoculars with me, and so they're small and light, and have them in my knapsack, and I'll stand near the base of the falls and look up at some of the plants that way. Okay, let's just look at a few of the plants, the flowering plants that occur in the Spray Cliff community. Some of these you may know, wet habitats as well. Mountain meadow rue, cliff saxifrage. It's a very common plant associated with rock outcrops where there's a bit of moisture. How about sundrops? You may know this one from driving the Blue Ridge Parkway in the summertime and roadside areas where there's a moist substrate. How about Appalachian bluet? And of course jewelweed you'll see in the Spray Cliff and other places. Maybe a hummingbird or two visiting the flowers. Invasives. We hear a lot about invasives. As I drove down Hickory Nut Gap this morning from Asheville, where I now live, there was a big sign on the road about getting rid of invasives. It was great. And of course, they're dealing with all that kudzu that is in the gap. But in the spray cliff community, invasives are few. There are few species of exotic invasive plants. One exception is this one, unfortunately, Japanese stiltgrass. Do you know this one? You may have it on your property. It's a bad one. It's a grass. It's not a big plant, but it spreads and can cover a large area. And I'm seeing it more and more commonly in the spray cliff community in places like Great Smoky Mountain National Park. It's sad. I hate to see that. But of course, the risk here is that as this plant spreads in the spray cliff and grabs some more rocks and soil, it's going to eliminate or reduce the number of native plants. So it's a plant that to be concerned about in this community. On a happier note, in the Southern Appalachians, we're in paradise in terms of waterfalls. There are an enormous number of waterfalls. I don't know if you fully appreciate that. There's a book called Waterfalls in North Carolina by Kevin Adams, who did a very thorough survey of waterfalls in North Carolina, estimates in western North Carolina alone about 1,000 waterfalls. Many of, a fair number of them are on private lands, but many are on public lands. So we're in an area that's particularly, where waterfalls are particularly abundant. Why is that? Well, I think you can probably guess. Simplistically, it's because of our high rainfall, our diverse topography, and our very large number of rivers. So we've got all the ingredients necessary to have lots of waterfalls. In contrast, in many parts of the world, people have never heard or seen a waterfall because they're not present. Many parts of the world, waterfalls don't exist at all. In the eastern United States, in the coastal plain, waterfalls are very rare because of the relatively flat terrain. But where waterfalls do occur, they tend to be and there's a hike associated with them. Hikes to waterfalls tend to be the most popular hikes, the most popular trails. In Great Smoky Mountain National Park, they're certainly the most popular trails along the Blue Ridge Parkway. The trail to Linville Gorge is, and its waterfall is, I think, the most popular hike according to the Park Service. Because of their popularity, many nature enthusiasts, or at least some nature enthusiasts, tend to avoid waterfall hikes. They say, oh, there are too many people. I don't want to hike there. Well, my answer to that, in writing this book on waterfalls and wildflowers, I spent a lot of time hiking to waterfalls in the Southern Appalachians, a 5-state region. Visited each of the 30 hikes about a dozen times. I find that if you get an early start, if you start out early in the morning, if you're on the trail by 7:30, 8 o'clock, you're likely to see very few people. So that's one way to get around the crowds. The other thing is there are massive seasonal differences. If you hike in the early spring, often that's a great time for wildflowers and not so many people. Okay, so even if you like to be on an uncrowded trail, these hikes can be interesting and you can find suitable conditions. Okay, in hiking to waterfalls, I've noticed that for many people it's simply a destination hike. It's all about getting to the waterfall, and they kind of have the blinders on, right? They're walking, I got to get to the waterfall, nothing else is interesting. And I think if you have that tunnel vision, if you're not observing and exploring along the way, you're missing out on at least half the fun. So I wrote this book on waterfalls and wildflowers to try and try and spark interest and help people in terms of interpreting some of the things that you see on these trails. Okay, so what I'd like to do now in the rest of the talk really is to take you on a virtual waterfall hike and interpret some of the things that we'll see along the way. And the hike I've chosen happens to be to Crabtree Falls, the waterfall off the Blue Ridge Parkway about an hour north of Asheville. And if you haven't been on this hike or don't think you'll ever get there, I think it's still relevant because many of the things we'll talk about you can see on on other trails. By the way, how many of you have been on the Crabtree Falls? Okay, so many of you actually have been there. It's one of my favorite waterfall hikes. People ask me, what's your favorite waterfall hike? And my standard response is, who's your favorite child? You know, you like different waterfall hikes for different reasons. You know, it's hard to pick one. So, right at the trailhead, right from the start, if you're hiking in mid-spring to about midsummer, you're going to see fire pink and black cohosh. And fire pink is a classic hummingbird adapted plant. It has those bright red flowers that are full of nectar. Don't have a sense of smell. So the plant isn't producing a fragrance. In contrast, black cohosh is quite pungent, particularly if you get your nose close to it. And it's not a smell. Black cohosh flowers don't produce a fragrance that we like, but it is very attractive to carrion flies and carrion beetles, which feed on rotting stuff. It's very attractive to them, and they're attracted to the flowers. Soon the trail meanders through a meadow-like area, and this is an area that they mow once a year in the fall. And as such, this is the one area that's very open and very sunny. And there's a wide diversity of wildflowers in this meadow-like area from spring through fall, including 3 species of milkweed. So let me point to those milkweeds. Butterfly weed is one. Many of you know butterfly weed. Common milkweed is another. Common milkweed is a wonderful plant to attract monarch butterflies as a larval host plant. And our third one is poke milkweed, which is equally good to attract monarch butterflies. Milkweeds, of course, as many of you know, are called milkweeds because of their milky sap. If you break a leaf, and you can do this, break a leaf and you'll see this white milky sap exuding out from its tissues. And in that milky sap are some really nasty alkaloids, which deter 99.9% of animals, including insect species, from feeding on this plant. So this is an adaptation by the plant to defend itself from things that eat it. Well, monarchs and a few other animals have evolved the ability to cope with this chemical. And the way that monarchs do it, and some of you know this, is that they store these alkaloids, these nasty chemicals, in their body, in certain areas of their body tissue. And so they've evolved a physiological tolerance to these alkaloids. They don't digest those chemicals. Instead, they store them in their tissue. And there's a benefit to the monarch in doing so, and that chemical now that's produced by the plant, stored in the monarch butterfly caterpillar, then deters animals from feeding on it. So it's overcome the plant defense mechanism, and to add sort of insult to injury, it's now using the plant defense chemical for its own defense. So birds tend to not want anything to do with monarch butterfly caterpillars or the adults, because the defense chemical is transferred. The adult develops from the pupal stage. And so monarch butterfly caterpillars are very conspicuous and brightly colored. Look at these yellow, white, and black stripes. They really stand out, whereas caterpillars of many other butterflies are kind of inconspicuous and are often kind of camouflage, often a green color. It's advertising its toxicity. Hey, don't eat me. I'm toxic, sort of thing. So it's a neat story. So soon you're in, as you follow the trail, you're into an oak hickory forest, and that's one of our more common communities that occurs all the way from the coastal region of the Carolinas up through the Piedmont and well up into the mountains. Okay, and it's called oak hickory forest for a reason, because there are a number of oak and hickory species. There are other trees too. Oaks and hickories and ashes and maples and many of our other deciduous trees are wind pollinated. So if I asked you to describe the flower of an oak tree or maybe an ash, or even a hickory, you may have a hard time doing that. The flowers are not very conspicuous because they're pollinated by the wind, and often these wind-pollinated trees, they flower, most of them, flower very early in the spring, even before their leaves leaf out. And that way the leaves don't get in the way of this pollen dispersal. So oaks and hickories, and then you've got other trees in there like tulip poplar, or I say tulip tree because it's not a true poplar. It's an insect pollinated tree, so that it's an exception. It has large showy flowers that produce nectar, and it's an important nectar source for bees in late spring or early summer. Okay, American chestnut. On this trail, you're going to come across American chestnut. The root sprouts of American chestnut, and they look like this here. They have these toothed leaves, sharply toothed leaves. And if you come across a chestnut, American chestnut root sprout that's growing in a particularly good site, meaning a site that's open and gets a lot of sun, you may be fortunate enough to see it in flower. Now, if you were hiking this trail 100 years ago, you may have seen American chestnut trees that look like this. Okay? So where you see chestnut sprouts, you know that there were once big chestnut trees there. What those chestnuts, the reason why those chestnut sprouts are there, the fungus that caused the chestnut blight kills the above ground part of the tree, doesn't kill the roots. So the chestnut sprouts that we see today are of trees that have been around for a long time, over 100 years. And they continue to send up sprouts from their persistent root system. There's energy, there's food in there for them to do this. And those sprouts will photosynthesize and grow and add nutrients, which are stored back in the roots. And then they succumb to the chestnut blight. So these sprouts then will be attacked by the chestnut blight fungus. It's still around. And the reason why it's still around is because the chestnut blight fungus, this particular species of fungus, does attack other trees, including northern red oak is one. But it doesn't kill northern red oak. But it survives in it, and the fungus produces spores. So there's still spores around. So these sprouts, after a decade or so, they die back due to the fungus, and then the tree then can send up more sprouts. We really don't know how much longer these trees are going to be able to survive. You know, that they're not immortal. Eventually these trees are going to die. Somebody had a question.
I have a question.
Yeah.
My dad bought some hybridized chestnuts, and we planted some offshoots up near the natural ones. Of course, they grow wild, and they any chance they would ever cross-pollinate, pick up the traits that would keep it resistant to that?
It's possible, but they probably be as resistant because in a paternal plant, and there'd be some reduction in resistance is the likelihood. So, on the other hand, you know, mutations occur, and you know, things happen, and you know, people have been looking for resistant, naturally resistant American chestnuts. I think you're alluding to the American Chestnut Society has had a long ongoing program to American chestnut hybridizing with Asian chestnuts, which are resistant to it for the most part, and they're trying to get that have much of the American chestnut genome as possible, so that it's as similar to the American chestnut as possible, and to have the resistance. Yeah.
What in time is the association between the death of the chestnut and the almost eradication of the red oaks over, in the Pisgahs? They had a tanning place in Rosamond, and most of the, as I understand it, the red oaks were cut for the tannin in the plant. What is there any? I don't know exactly when the chestnut started to die.
Yeah, with the blight, just very quickly on this because I don't want to take too much time. The botanical gardens, arboretum, are wonderful places, but some mistakes are made inadvertently. The chestnut fungus, what caused the chestnut blight, is thought to have been introduced to the New York Botanical Garden in about 1900, very early 1900s. They didn't know it. You know, this interest in exotic plants and botanical gardens, arboretum, often, you know, bring in plants from different parts of the world for people to enjoy. They didn't realize, had no idea that there was this fungus on the plant. Now, the Asian chestnuts are largely resistant to the blight, but our American chestnut had never been exposed to it. So, and this fungus spreads by spores, which are dispersed by wind. And in the 1930s is when the chestnut blight hit the Southern Appalachians. They were just totally decimated in the Southern Appalachians. Okay, so let's move on. You know, the American Chestnut Society is now centered in Asheville. So if some of you are really interested in this topic, I'm sure you could contact that group, and they'd be happy to somebody to come down and give a talk on the American chestnut. Yeah. Okay, so we need to continue our hike, and I mentioned that the American chestnut, it's a species that does best in light, and high amounts of light. And ditto with this plant here, Turk's cap lily. But in an oak hickory forest, and we're still in an oak hickory forest here, there are gaps, there are openings in the forest, small openings in some cases. Trees fall down and create an opening. You're familiar with that if you're a hiker. And colonizing those gaps, those openings, are plants like Turk's cap lily. You also see this plant in bloom in mid to late summer along the Blue Ridge Parkway and other places. It's our tallest lily. It's our most spectacular lily. It gets up to 8 feet tall, maybe even 10 feet tall in some cases, and produces numerous very large, showy orange to red nodding flowers, which are rich in nectar and attract lots of butterflies. Almost always when you see a Turk's cap lily, you almost always see butterflies on it, nectaring. They are mostly various species of swallowtail butterflies, such as you see here. This is a plant that depends on butterflies, and perhaps some other insects can accomplish pollination as well. But without butterflies and other insect pollinators, this plant will die out. It cannot pollinate and produce seeds on its own. This is interesting. I don't have my shot of pipevine for some reason, but fortunately there's a second slide here. Many of you know pipevine, I think. It's a common vine. It has these large heart-shaped leaves. It, like other vines, it climbs. And the reason why vines climb is they're trying to get up to where there's more light. And a benefit of being a vine is that they don't have to expend a lot of energy, resources in producing a large, thick, supportive trunk. They utilize other plants or walls as a support structure. So this is a common plant in our mountains, a very common plant in our mountains, and it also attracts swallowtail butterflies, particularly pipevine swallowtails, but not for nectar. Pipevine swallowtails, as you see here, are not going to pipevines for nectar, but rather they're going to them for what reason? As a larval host plant. You got it, as a larval host plant. In fact, the pipevine swallowtail butterfly, the reason why it's called pipevine swallowtail butterfly is because it's a specialist on pipevines. Its only suitable larval host plant is pipevines, and there's several different species. So the female pipevine swallowtails are flying around looking for pipevines, maybe smelling too, to lay their eggs. And this is another plant that has some nasty chemicals in it. Very few animals or insects on pipevines because of some very nasty chemicals in their leaves. But pipevine swallowtails have evolved the ability to cope with those chemicals, and like monarchs, they store the chemicals in their body tissue, and the tissue caterpillars. And this is another caterpillar that's not inconspicuous. It stands out. Hey, don't eat me, I'm toxic. It's black and it has these orange spots. So it exhibits what's called warning coloration. It's warning potential predators that you probably don't want to fool with me. Okay, and how do these predators learn? The predators are birds. How do they learn? Well, they may feed on one, and they're pretty quick learners. From the Oak Hickory Forest, the trail meanders into a Rose Bay rhododendron tunnel. You've been through these things if you're a hiker, where the rhododendrons kind of branch up over, it looks like you're under a tunnel of rhododendrons, which is kind of interesting, but if you're a wildflower enthusiast, it's not the best habitat because wildflowers tend to be rather sparse. There are not many species of wildflowers that can grow under these rhododendron thickets. And a main reason for that is underneath these rhododendron thickets, you often have a thick layer of slowly decomposing leaves. It can be 4, 5, 6, 8 inches deep. So a seedling, a seed that germinates and tries to establish and grow, the seedling roots grow through the duff. This decomposing leaves has a very difficult time. In fact, foresters often don't like rhododendrons because not only does it impede herbaceous plants, but trees have a hard time establishing as from seed under these rhododendron thickets. So in heavily managed forests, they often use fire as a management tool to kill back the rhododendrons to promote tree regeneration. It's Halloween, so we need to talk about witch hazel and why witch hazel is called witch hazel. There are lots of witch hazel plants. They're shrubs to a small tree growing along this trail and elsewhere in the Southern Appalachians. And you often find on the leaves these structures. These are galls. These are galls, these sharp-tipped, looks like a witch's hat, are galls that are caused by an aphid. By an aphid, a female aphid lays an egg into the leaf. She has an ovipositor, pushes it into the leaf, lays an egg, and injects a chemical which causes the plant to produce this abnormal growth. The egg hatches, and the larvae then feeds within the gall and gains food and protection and good substrate to survive in, and then eventually makes a little hole in the base here on the underside of the leaf and flies off as an adult. So that's kind of an interesting thing on witch hazel is the frequent occurrence of these galls. Of course, galls are not unique to witch hazel. Galls grow on lots and lots of different plants, have galls in various shapes, sizes, and colors. One other interesting thing about witch hazel is the time in which it flowers. It's actually flowering right now. And the end of October, early November, it flowers in late fall when most other plants are shutting down for the season. Even witch hazel is kind of shutting down when it's flowering. The leaves are usually turning yellow, and yet that's when the plant flowers. The flowers kind of look like pom-poms here. They're rich in nectar and they attract a wide variety of insects which function as pollinators, including moths. Bear corn, or squawroot. You know this plant. You've seen it. It's common in the spring. And bear corn is a good name for it for a couple of reasons. One, it kind of looks like ears of corn popping up through the soil, popping up from the litter. Where's the green? Where are the green leaves? Where's the chlorophyll? Not to be found. This is a parasitic plant. This is a plant that parasitizes the roots of trees, mainly oak trees. And it's a flowering plant. It's an angiosperm. And so these are the shoots. These are the shoots. Usually have clusters here, multiple shoots. And the shoots are just densely covered with flowers. Bumblebees visit the flowers for nectar and function as pollinators. And bears often feed on this plant, including very early in spring after the plants have emerged. Now, I'm told by people who know more about this than me that when bears come out of hibernation, they have some problems. Do you know what I mean? Well, it turns out this plant has a natural laxative. This plant has a natural laxative and which promotes a bowel movement. So that's one reason why the bears seek out this plant. And they really do seek out this plant. I was hiking to Rainbow Falls in Great Smoky Mountain National Park a couple of summers ago. It's one of the trails in the book, one of the hikes in the book. And I watched a bear from a distance of about 50 yards, going from clump to clump of this plant for at least 45 minutes. And what it did is it just fed on all the above ground shoots and then dug and fed on the underground part too that was connected to the root of the host tree. And these bears, though, may have those digestive problems later in the season as well, because they continue to visit this plant later on, including in later spring and maybe early summer as well, when the fruits of this plant are mature. And the fruits of bear corn look like small grapes. And in those grape-like fruits are literally thousands of seeds per fruit. They're tiny, tiny little seeds. And so when the bear feeds on this plant, when it's in fruit and the seeds are ripe, those tiny little seeds readily pass through the digestive, the gut of the bear and are dispersed in the bear's dropping. So bears actually, there's a mutualism here. The plant is providing this natural laxative and perhaps some food value as well. And in turn, the plant benefits by being dispersed by the bear. So there are lots of interesting interactions in nature, lots of antagonistic interactions, but also some mutually beneficial interactions as well, such as this one. Okay, well, soon the trail then, as it goes down slope towards a waterfall, it enters a cove-like area, a more sheltered area, sheltered from the wind and excess sunlight. And it's an area, too, where the soil is deeper. And because it's sheltered, the soil is more moist. And this habitat is called a rich cove forest. And it's a community that's particularly species-rich in trees. An unusual diversity of trees characterize this community, as well as an unusually high diversity of herbaceous plants. Okay, so botanically, this is a particularly interesting community. And I give a lecture on the Rich Cove Forest, and I don't want to keep you here for 2 or 3 hours, so I'm only going to show you 3 plants here from this Rich Cove Forest. It's my favorite community to talk about. But here are 3 plants that occur in the Rich Cove Forest. Some of you are familiar with them. Soon the trail exits the Rich Cove Forest and enters what's called an acidic cove forest. And this is also a sheltered area. But here the soil is very acidic. The rock type is different between a rich cove forest and an acidic cove forest. And so you have a very acidic soil. And so you don't have so many tree species. And you don't have that dense herbaceous layer, but you do have a dense cover of shrubs, various rhododendrons, mountain laurel, blueberries, and things of that nature. Part of the difference in vegetation is that in a rich cove forest, you have a high pH soil, what's described as a high pH soil, at least for our area, a pH that's close to 6, maybe even 7. And that higher pH soil increases nutrient availability. Soils in the mountains in Piedmont and low in nutrients. High acidity reduces nutrient availability to plants. Okay, in the tree cover in this acidic cove forest, a couple of magnolias, which you'll see on this trail, are these 2, Fraser magnolia, one of my favorite trees, and cucumber magnolia. And magnolias, as you probably know, have rather fragrant flowers. The smell differs. Some are sweet, some are repugnant to the human nose, and kind of Fraser magnolia has kind of a sweet to sour kind of fragrance. And the fragrance of magnolias is there because they attract beetles. They're typically beetle pollinated. If you were hiking this trail 6 years ago or so, maybe 10 years ago, you'd have seen some really nice, healthy eastern hemlocks, Tsuga canadensis, but today, sadly, they're dead, are near dead, because of the hemlock woolly adelgid. On a happier note, if you're hiking in late spring or early summer, you're likely to see mountain laurel or rose bay rhododendron, and they're beautiful flowers. And on the forest floor in this acidic cove forest, you'll likely encounter Indian cucumber root. And Indian cucumber root is an interesting plant in a number of ways. It's called cucumber root because it has a root, actually a rhizome, that's kind of swollen, and Native Americans and mountain folks in the pioneer era and beyond would eat these rhizomes. Tasted a bit like a cucumber. Okay, the most colorful and showy part of this plant appears in late summer when the plant is going to fruit. The flowers are kind of inconspicuous, but as the fruits develop, as the fruits ripen, they change in color from green to this dark purple or black. And interestingly, as the fruits are changing color, the leaf bases beneath the fruits change from green to scarlet. Why? Why is that? Well, this plant, it's beneficial for plants to disperse their seeds. If all the seeds drop beneath the parent plant, that wouldn't be good. There'd be a lot of sibling competition, and the population would tend to die back. By dispersing the seeds, the plant can spread into new habitats and increase its numbers. So in this case then, those contrasting colors of the leaf and the ripe fruit help attract birds, pulp, and disperse the seeds. Have very good vision, and they notice these contrasting colors, and that helps get their attention. There's surprises along the way on any hike, and one surprise on the Crabtree Falls hike is American lily of the valley. This is a plant that I don't see very often in the Southern Appalachians. There's a relative of this species, which is from Europe, that sometimes is grown in gardens, but this is a relatively uncommon plant in the Southern Appalachians. In contrast, another native lily that's much more common and widespread is this one here, speckled wood lily, sometimes called Clinton's lily, in the genus Clintonia. Okay, the trail then leaves this acidic cove forest, and as we are getting down close to the waterfall, we enter another rich cove forest. And this rich cove forest has some nice seepage slopes, water flowing down the slope, sometimes above ground, sometimes below ground. And associated with these seepage slopes is this wonderful plant called umbrella leaf. It's a well-named plant because of its large umbrella-like leaves. That's one of the largest leaves, I think, in our native herbaceous flora. And of course, that very large, horizontally oriented leaf benefits the plant because underneath the deep shade of the forest canopy, where there's not much light reaching the forest floor, having a large, broad surface increases the amount of light that the plant can capture and utilize in photosynthesis and producing sugars and growing and such. The trade-off, however, and if you're a gardener, you know this, if you've got those large leaves with that broad surface, that's a plant that's going to need a lot of moisture, because as that plant is photosynthesizing, it has these tiny little pores, millions of tiny pores on the leaf surface that are losing water vapor. So as the plant is taking CO2 in photosynthesis, it's losing water vapor. So in order to avoid desiccation, the plant has to take up moisture to replace that water that's lost by transpiration. So this is a plant that's restricted to very moist habitats where there's lots of moisture in the soil, such as these seepage slopes. And then if we look at the flowers and fruits, here are the flowers of umbrella leaf, and then the fruits, like Indian cucumber root, this has these contrasting colors. In this case, the fruits, when ripe, turn a bluish purple color, and the stalks just beneath them turn from green to bright red. Again, enhancing the attractiveness for birds, which disperse the seed. Finally, at long last, we're at Crabtree Falls. And so here we've got this beautiful white water bouncing down numerous narrow ledges, some 70 feet before reaching a small pool, plunge pool at the base. And this black rock behind the white water is amphibolite. It's a rock that's rich in calcium and magnesium, and that calcium and magnesium elevates the soil pH. And on the slope adjacent to the waterfall, shown here, is an area very rich in wildflowers, much like you'd see in a rich cove forest. Again, because of the higher pH, because of this particular rock type. So I can't go over, don't have time to go over all the plants, but several highlights are 2 species of trillium, wake robin and large flowered trillium, blue cohosh, wild ginger, jack-in-the-pulpit, and lots of other plants there as well. In the Spray Cliff community at Crabtree Falls, you'll see Appalachian bluet and mountain meadowrue. And again, that cold air downdraft and mist creating that cool, moist microclimate allows a number of species that are normally associated with high elevations to grow at this mid-elevation site, elevation of about 3,200 feet, including, as I mentioned before, mountain wood sorrel, those beautiful, look at those stripes, how neat, yellow birch, and mountain maple, all high elevation species occurring down here because of that microclimate. So let me end here by just, if you'll bear with me for just a few more minutes, let me just tell you just a little bit about the Waterfalls and Wildflowers book, which came out this past spring, published by University of North Carolina Press. So it's Waterfalls and Wildflowers in the Southern Appalachians-thirty great hike. This is a photo of Pearson's Falls, and there's a docent from Pearson Falls here today. Was happy to see the cover has from Pearson Falls. That's one of the hikes in the book. Okay, so the book has 30 interpretive hikes. 18 of the 30 are in western North Carolina, reflecting the abundance of waterfalls in western North Carolina. And then there are 3 waterfalls from 4 adjoining states. These are interpretive hikes. So the hikes are described in a similar way to what I described today. Not quite as verbose, but just I try to interpret what you see. Okay, and then also, and this is a handy feature, people tell me that this is helpful. With each interpretive hike, I have a plant list. Okay, I have a plant list of representative species, common and conspicuous plants that you're likely to see along the trail, and they're arranged seasonally. Okay, so it's a helpful feature. It makes it easier to identify the plants. Okay, and so because in the hike descriptions, I tell you what communities you're entering and exiting and so on, what communities you are in along the trail. For 10 of the most common communities encountered, I have a section of the book describes the characteristics of those communities and how to identify them and such. And then to help you identify plants, this isn't comprehensive, but I have 125 of the most common conspicuous plants where I have a photo and a description and something, at least 1 or 2 things that are interesting about them. It is a wildflower and true waterfall book. And believe it or not, there's a little bit of poetry in the book too. And these are poets, these are regional poets, poets of the region. This is just a very short poem by Catherine Stripling Beyer, who is the former poet laureate of North Carolina. And another poem was by Peter White, who's a botanical researcher and recently retired botanical garden director at the Botanical Garden of North Carolina. And let me just take a minute. I want to read you his poem. And I particularly like this poem because it's poetry, but it's also biology and ecology. And maybe you'll get you'll recognize that. So here's his poem, Peter White. It's called Community, Forest and the Trees. Maple, ash, and birch, hemlock, basswood, beech. What is this assembled crew? A fast grower, slow grower, shade lover, light lover. Some feed birds for traveling seeds, but others send seeds freely on the wind. The different trees have different personalities, but are they the pieces of a symphony or just some random company? Sit and listen, sit and watch, and enjoy the forest's mystery. Thank you. Let me just end with one word of caution here. And I'm not talking about snakes, copperheads, or what have you. I'm not talking about bears, and I'm not talking about slippery rocks. So slippery rocks is something we should be concerned about near waterfalls. Instead, I just want to give you a warning that, and some of you already know this and may have this issue, exploring waterfalls and wildflowers can become an obsession for which there is no known cure. So be careful. And so get out in the woods and enjoy it and have fun. And thank you for coming out this morning.